Thanks for checking out part 2 of my workbench build. If you haven't seen part 1, what are you doing? Go back and watch part 1. Just to recap, in part 1, I built the bottom part of the workbench and attached the casters in order to make it mobile. Having a mobile workbench in your shop, especially if it's a shared space, is extremely beneficial if you need to get that workbench out of the way, or you need to move it from one end of, say, your garage to the next, or you want to race other people on your street that have mobile workbenches. That's why casters are great to have on them. Now in this part of the workbench build, I'm going to build the top in addition to adding the table saw and then finishing the workbench. Now let's get into part 2 of this workbench build. Now that I had the bottom portion of the workbench completed, it was time to lay out and frame the top part of the workbench, which would be the assembly table, outfeed table, and also hold up my table saw. Right here, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to assemble the top part of the workbench, and I decided to use pocket screws and pocket holes again. However, I didn't ultimately end up using this method because I started to run into some issues with the pocket holes that I had drilled into the 2x4s, possibly incorrectly. Now I should also mention that the square bit that I'm using is a generic non-Craig brand drill bit, and I really was having a tough time getting a hold of the top of the pocket screws, as you can see here. So just buy the Craig bits. They're gonna save you a ton of frustration. Drill bit sucks. Also, you'll want to make sure that you drill your pocket holes correctly, because I did not. So I just ended up butt joining everything like I did on the bottom frame. Last time I tried to get fancy with pocket holes. Since I was building this by myself, I used some clamps to hold up the top part of the frame to the legs so I could get it level, and then screw it in and attach it to the bottom portion of the workbench. Once I completed the outfeed and assembly table portion, I tested for strength and then moved on to the section that would hold up my table saw. Since this section would be holding up my table saw, I thought that my weight would be good enough to test the strength of the frame. Once the workbench frame was completely assembled, it was time to put on the top. I'm using a full sheet of MDF here that I'm going to cut into 2 pieces, one for the assembly and outfeed area, and the other to hold the table saw. Now you're about to see an improper way to cut this sheet of MDF. I should have done this on the floor, and I really screwed this cut up. But I decided to live with my mistake and move on to the bottom section of MDF and notch out with a jigsaw the corners around the 2x4 supports. Here I'm setting down my table saw to make sure that it sits slightly above the outfeed section of the workbench, and it looks like for once I finally got something right. To protect the edges of the MDF top, I am attaching some trim pieces around it using glue and brad nails. Now I wasn't very precise with my cuts, but I just sanded off each of the edges and made it nice and flush. Since I was already down here, I decided to attach this portion of the MDF to the frame. I used this scrap furring strip to cover up the gap between the edge of the MDF top and the legs of the workbench, and then I put edge banding all around that section as well. After putting the proper brad nails in my nail gun, I attached the top to the workbench frame, and just like that, everything was together. Honestly, this part of the build was the one that made me the most nervous. Using a 3/4 inch router bit, I routed miter slots into the MDF top. I really only had one shot to get this right, and I think I did an okay job. In order to protect the MDF top, I covered it in shellac. In total, I added about 3 coats, sanding in between with 220 grit sandpaper. Now, if you're going to do this to your workbench, it's very important that you follow all the instructions on the can and that you have some patience, which I struggle with sometimes when it comes to finishes. I have to say that when it was dry, I was very impressed with the final result. This last step isn't really necessary, but I decided to paint the workbench using this interior-exterior paint, and I really love this color. It goes along with other things in my shop, and I really dig this color scheme for shop furniture. After a few more coats, and once the paint dried, I was ready to start using this workbench. So that's it. That is the workbench outfeed assembly table build. Sure, there are many things I would do differently if I had to build this again, but I think this is a good starting point. I would like to upgrade this in the future at some point, adding drawers and some other storage options on this workbench. But right now, this really works for me, and I'm excited to start using it. Now, once I was done with the entire project, I added some handles just so I could move it around my shop a little bit easier. And I also added a large power strip so I could plug in things like my laptop or a light that I could put right over the workbench. Now, one thing I didn't show in the video was attaching the table saw to the actual workbench. I ended up bolting it down just so it wouldn't move on me, just because I wanted to make sure that the miter slots were aligned. Thanks for checking out this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe, only if you feel like it. It's your life, you do you. Until next time,